Logical Positivism. This was a movement of philosophy that flourished in the first half of the 20th century. And primarily, it originated in Austria. There was a famous group of philosophers who used to meet in the 30s, early 30s, in Austria, specifically Vienna, that included such people as Moritz Schlick, who was the person who sort of ran it, Otto Neurath, Hans Hahn, and Rudolf Carnap, among others. Other people sat in, who, for example, Karl Popper, who we'll be meeting later, who was a very influential philosopher of science, who I've got him listed under frenemies because in some respects he's sympathetic to what's going on with the logical positivist. He shares common enemies. Both logical positivists and Popper are critical of people like Hegel and Marx as a scientist, not necessarily Marx as a social theorist. And Heidegger, for example. But also Popper has a problem with a key tenet, perhaps the key tenet of logical positivism, which we'll be looking at in more detail in a second, which A.J. Ayer talks about. Yeah, so Ayer is the English representative. He sat in the Vienna Circle as a very young man. Both he and Quine were very young attenders of the meetings of the Vienna Circle. The Vienna Circle disbanded as the 30s wore on because a lot of them were Jewish and all of them are intellectuals, and Nazism was on the rise. Moritz Schlick stayed behind and died. He was shot by a former pupil, and some people say the former pupil was just crazy, you know, like Mark David Chapman shooting John Lennon. Other people are convinced that Schlick was shot because of the Nazis, that the Nazis wanted him dead. So there's a philosophy conspiracy theory for you right there. But anyway, Schlick was an early leader and died. His life was cut short by a bullet, which is unusual for philosophers, thankfully. People like Rudolf Carnap was perhaps the the person who had the longest influence, because he moved over to America and settled in, and he and Quine had sort of an ongoing exchange. And Carnap did his best to continue and sort of modify the tenets of logical positivism in the face of serious criticisms. In general, logical positivism is seen to be a movement that flourished, that burned brightly, and then was swept away. There's nobody nowadays who claims to be a logical positivist. There are certainly people who think stuff that Carnap said is right, but they sort of changed their name. They ceased to be labeled as logical positivists. They're just sort of empiricists. But it had lasting effects, even though it sort of didn't last very long. It had lasting effects in that it was a very radical movement that aimed to sort of sweep away a lot of what counted as philosophy. And it did that. It had a huge influence, not just in the German-speaking world, but because the Vienna Circle, because of people like A.J. Ayer who sat in, and because the members of the Vienna Circle went to England and America to escape the Nazis and became important figures there. It had a huge influence in the English-speaking world. And it was like, you know, punk in music. The logical positivists, the punks of philosophy, in that they sort of rubbished what came before and had very strict rules for what counted as philosophy. And this had a sort of chilling effect on some parts of philosophy that they deemed unworthy for quite a while. And it was basically the 70s before their influence had really worn off, and work had sort of tended to blossom again in fields that they were critical of. Okay, so we're going to, well, yes, I should say a bit about their concerns. Perhaps their major historical influence is Hume. And Hume makes a distinction that they thoroughly endorse between, well, they don't use his language. His language is between relations of ideas and matters of fact. Hume says that these are two types of truth. Relations of ideas are the contentful ones, where, no, I'm sorry, relations of ideas are what we now call analytic claims. That is something like Hesperus is Hesperus, where it's true, but its truth does not depend on any facts about the world. Its truth depends on just rules of language. Hesperus is Hesperus cannot possibly be false because of the meanings of the words. Now, consequently, analytic truths don't really tell us anything. They're just sort of true by definition. And so they do count as meaningful and true, but in some sense, they're a lesser kind of truth. And it's worrisome that, for example, the logical positivist counted all of the claims of math as analytic. And we'll get to that as a criticism in a little bit. But the interesting stuff is the matters of fact, according to Hume, or synthetic truths, according to later terminology. This is what science is interested in. These are actual informative claims about the world that are discoveries, that are news, that aren't just true by definition. They're true, but they could have been false. So it's interesting to discover that they are in fact true. Now, Hume said all truths can be divided into these two. Anything that doesn't fall into these two, he had, this is one of the most famous passages in philosophy. It's Hume writing, I can't remember if this is the Treatise or the Inquiry, but he says, when we run over libraries persuaded of these principles, that truths are divided into these two camps, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics was the kind of philosophy that was in vogue in the Middle Ages that the early modern philosophers like Descartes, Locke, Hume, Leibniz, Spinoza kind of swept away. It was basically working on the principles that Aristotle had laid down and making very fine distinctions. It's basically footnotes to Aristotle. Early modern philosophy came along and said, forget that stuff. So if we take in our hand a volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain an abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? That would be relations of ideas. So that's one of the two categories. No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning containing matter of fact and existence? That's the other category, matters of fact or synthetic truths. No. So if it doesn't, so in other words, it doesn't fall into either of the two groups that count. What do we do then? Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. So this is very radical. Now, Hume is speaking kind of metaphorically, but you know, there's steel behind his words. He's saying there's all of this shit that philosophers churn out, that philosophers and theologians churn out, claiming to be meaningful and deep. But there's a simple test that you can do. Run my test on what they're saying, and if it fails the test, that basically means it's bullshit. It's empty. It's meaningless. And you can burn it with no loss to humankind. That is almost exactly what the positivists are recommending with their verification principle. So Hume is a very important influence. Also, more recent influences before the positivists are Frege and Russell, and the early Wittgenstein. The early Wittgenstein actually was one of the people who visited the Vienna Circle. The early Wittgenstein, he was an architect, I think, training to be an architect at the time. Wittgenstein is kind of a cult figure. We'll talk about Wittgenstein in more detail. The big thing about Wittgenstein is that he has two stages, at least two stages, but two clearly distinct stages in his philosophy. There's the early Wittgenstein, where he's influenced by Frege and Russell. He meets Frege. Frege tells him, "You're smart, go work with Russell." He goes work with Russell, and then he produces this work called the Tractatus, while he's fighting in World War I, on the wrong side, I might add. He produces this work called the Tractatus, which is notoriously hard. It's very austere, it's very terse, it's structured in this weird way where there's sort of 7 basic principles and then there's sort of footnotes to them. One of my professors in the early days of the internet suggested it would make a great hypertext. In other words, you just start with the 7 principles and you click on them and it would take you to the others. So it has this structure, and it's very, as I said, it's very terse. There's quotes from it in one of the readings that I gave you from the Miller book of Philosophy of Language. It starts with quotes from the Tractatus, and they say things like, to understand a proposition means to know what is the case if it is true. That's one of the more understandable and clear-cut statements of it. But it's basically presenting a picture that is in keeping with the Frege-Russell project of, logic is clear and unambiguous, and it's informative in that it tells us something about the world. The logical positivists really like that. And actually, the logical positivists are very much, if they're influenced by anything more than anything else, it's the progress that science is making at the time. This is the time of Einstein. So science is making huge advances in our understanding of the world, and the logical positivists sort of look at the way science is exploding and compare it with philosophy, which at the time was very much influenced by Hegel, in the same way that at the time of the early moderns, you had sort of Aristotle looming over everything, and he was, all respectable philosophy was just talking about Aristotle. It wasn't entirely that way with Hegel, but certainly in the German-speaking world, Hegel was an undue influence. And actually, Hegel had an influence on British philosophy in this guy called F.H. Bradley, who's a 19th century Hegelian, who taught some of the early figures. He taught G.E. Moore, for example, who was a contemporary of Russell's and considered, along with Russell, the founder of analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy has a lot in common with logical positivism. It's very much committed to the idea that you've got to be clear and you've got to say something. Quine, also very much interested in science, very much in the positivist camp that science is doing the important work and philosophy should be influenced by science, but has some key differences with the positivists and writes a famous article that is also hard to read. Quine writes beautifully but doesn't write very clearly. It's almost like he's committed to style over substance. But the sort of landmark article that kind of put the boot into logical positivism by Quine is called Two Dogmas of Empiricism, and it actually attacks this key distinction of Hume's between relation and ideas and matters of fact, between analytic and synthetic, and claims that you can't support that key distinction. And if you can't, that undermines basically a lot of the logical positivist project. Let's see. Okay, so one of the things that Moritz Schlick says famously is the meaning of a proposition is its method of verification. Now, this is actually saying something slightly different from what Ayer says in the reading, which is the reading that we did for Ayer is The Elimination of Metaphysics, which is chapter 1 of his book, Language, Truth and Logic. This was actually a lot like Hume. Hume's treatise was written when Hume was in his early 20s, and it's like one of the masterpieces of philosophy, and he wrote it, you know, when he was but a lad. And it's seen as, you know, he was this prodigy. Ayer, very much influenced by Hume, writes Language, Truth and Logic when he's in his early 20s, so he's seen as this prodigy. Hume's treatise fell stillborn from the press, as he put it at the time. Didn't seem to catch on with many people, so he rewrote it as the treatise, divided it into 2 sections, rewrote it in a more accessible fashion, as he thought. That failed too, so he quit and went into writing history and wrote one of the best-selling works of English history ever written. So he was all right, but and it was only later, after he died, when Kant read Hume, that the true importance of Hume's work really sank in. And Kant is, the fact that Hume was a huge influence on Kant, even though they disagreed, Kant famously said Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. That's when Hume kind of took off and became as famous for his philosophy as he was for his history. Ayer wrote this Language, Truth and Logic, and that was kind of the big thing that he did in his philosophical life. He continued to be a respected philosopher in Britain. I think he was at Oxford, I want to say. I should know. You know, and lived a long life. He actually, everybody called him Freddie, so the A must be for Alfred. Actually, there's a story about the time A.J. Ayer almost got into a fight with Mike Tyson. So he clashed with celebrities. Look that one up. He would have been murdered. He was not a big guy, but he was a feisty guy, put it that way. All right, so Ayer writes this work, Language, Truth and Logic, which is seen as sort of a polemic of a manifesto, if you will, of logical positivism. It's not, I mean, not all logical positivists would agree with everything it said, and it seems to be sort of the more extreme version of logical positivism, but it has the great virtue of being clear, of being clear and being bold. So people love it for that. And certainly this first chapter is called The Elimination of Metaphysics. So metaphysics is this big area of philosophy where we talk about things that science can't talk about, like free will, like the basic substances of the universe. Not substance in the way that science talks about, but substance as in, is mind a substance? Is matter... You know, the ancient Greeks were interested in metaphysics when they talked about, is matter composed of earth, air, fire, and water? The elimination of metaphysics means getting rid of this stuff that's been talked about for 2,000 years and just basically saying, yeah, that's stuff that all of you great philosophers were talking about for over 2 millennia. That's all bullshit. So, you know, pretty radical stuff. And the way that we eliminate it is very similar to what Hume suggested. There's the verification principle, which he calls the criterion of verifiability. We say that a sentence is factually significant to any given person. So notice, first of all, this verifiability is relativized to each individual. And then there's going to be a version of this that is just in general. So we say that a sentence is factually significant to any given person if and only if he knows how to verify that proposition which it purports to express. That is, if he knows what observations would lead him under certain conditions to accept the proposition as being true or reject it as being false. So this is what makes something factually significant. That means capable of having truth value. If, on the other hand, the putative proposition is of such a character that the assumption of its truth or falsehood is consistent with any assumptions whatsoever concerning the nature of his future experience, that is, nothing could count as evidence for or against it in his future experiences. So, for example, an example of something that fails this test is we could live in the Matrix. We're in the Matrix, or as Descartes, if you're familiar with Descartes, Descartes said we could be being deceived by a demon deceiver. Our senses, which we think are telling us about the world, could actually be the product of someone just manipulating us, and there is no world as we think we see it. That claim is one of these claims that fails this criterion, because there is no evidence that could disprove it. That's one of the challenges to it. So that makes it, according to Ayer, essentially meaningless. As he goes on, if, on the other hand, the putative proposition is such a character that the assumption of its truth or falsehood is consistent with any assumption whatever concerning the nature of his future experience, then, as far as he is concerned, it is, if not a tautology, so that's the other alternative, it could be one of these things that's just true by nature of the meanings of the words that make it up, true by definition. If not a tautology, then it is a mere pseudo-proposition. Okay, what's a pseudo-proposition? So one of the objections to logical positivism, specifically focusing on the verification principle, is it seems to lump things together that we would say there's a clear distinction with them. So, for example, we're in the Matrix appears to be meaningful. We get what that means. It has words. They appear to be saying something. You know, I understand it. Contrast that with, in the article by Ziff, where he talks about a grouchy academic responding to a question when he's being tested for sanity, and he just makes noises like blurgle, urgle, or whatever. Now that's meaningless, whereas we would normally say this is meaningful. So are you saying that we're just lumping them together? Because if you are, that seems to be ignoring an important distinction. That seems to be a count against logical positivism if it says that two things that appear to be clearly distinct are in fact the same. So how can you say that that is a pseudo proposition? It's not an actual proposition that is asserting some claim. Well, this is where the positivists really love Russell's theory of descriptions. Not so much in what it does for, what it literally does applying to definite descriptions, but in what it's an example of. What it's an example of is taking the surface grammar of a statement in natural language, in this case English, and showing that the logical grammar is different from the surface grammar. So in Russell's theory of descriptions, he says the way we talk in English is we can make something like the King of France, which is a definite description. We can make that the subject of a sentence. And if we're committed to this idea that the meaning of a sentence is in part to do with what it picks out about the world, and if we think that the meaning of singular terms like names or like apparently definite descriptions is simply the objects they pick out in the world, then there's a problem with statements like the King of France is bald, because there is no King of France. Now, Meinong solved this problem by saying, okay, well, there must be, in some sense, a King of France. So he was so committed to the idea that the meaning of a term a singular term was the thing that it picked out, was that he said there must always be a thing that it picked out, even when there isn't such a thing in the real world. So he postulated this sort of spirit world where all of the possible things that we could talk about existed. So the King of France, in some sense, had this kind of shadow existence. Russell and Quine, in particular, were scathing about this and said, you know, it's like an ontological slum. You're just peopling the universe with stuff that shouldn't be there. And Russell has this clever solution where he explains that the surface grammar, the English sentence where the King of France plays the same role as a name would, is misleading. And really, the underlying grammar, the actual, what the sentence is actually saying, which can be revealed by predicate logic, is something very different. In fact, you replace a term with a quantifier and a variable. So this little trick is seen as like, wow, that's the ideal of what philosophy can do. Philosophy can, and this is something Wittgenstein said in his early work, and actually was committed to in his later work too, is that the job of philosophy is to clear up misconceptions. Because actually, the important stuff about finding out important truths about the world, these guys cede to science. Science does that. Science has the methodology for that. What we're doing is just the best thing we can come up with is tautologies, is analytic truth. What philosophy can do that is valuable still is we can show how sentences that appear meaningful in English, like we're in the Matrix, as contrasted with Blurgle Urgle, actually fail to say anything. So just as the theory of descriptions exposes that there's a difference between what is really being said by an apparently meaningful sentence, so philosophy can do that for just about any of the sentences of metaphysics. So Ayer himself quotes rather cheekily a sentence from Bradley: "The absolute enters into, but is itself incapable of evolution and progress." Now this is obviously a meaningful English sentence we would normally say, but what he's going to say is, no, it's a grammatical sentence, but probably he would say it's like sentences, that classic example of a sentence that has syntax but not that is syntactically correct but has no semantic meaning, which is colorless green ideas sleep furiously. So he would say that's basically what this is. Sure, it looks like it should be meaningful because it's got words in the right order and adjectives where there should be adjectives and so on. But when you look at it and when you apply the principle, then you find that actually it does nothing. So a helpful slogan for logical positivism is a difference must make a difference. That is, if there's a difference in meaning between two statements, this must register as a difference that we could verify, that there would be something that we could experience that would reveal the difference. So yes, the logical positivists are very much influenced by empiricists like Hume. That is, knowledge comes from our senses. So there has to be sensory input in the future that would reveal the difference, which is why we're in the Matrix is meaningless, because that essentially is a claim that all of our senses are misleading. And so none of our senses could reveal that our senses are misleading. Now, there's a worry about the formulation of the verification principle. You can, and this is revealed, this is talked about in the, well, actually, Ayer himself talks about this. He makes two distinctions between types of verifiability. So, there's practical verifiability versus verifiability in principle. Now, think of a claim, there are mountains on the far side of the moon. Does that pass the verification test? Well, not if we are still focusing on is it meaningful for me, then no, it appears not to, because there is no, I'm never going to be on the far side of the moon. I'm never going to see it. Maybe I'm a quitter in saying that, but I'm pretty certain that I'm never going to see the far side of the moon. So I cannot verify that. Does that mean that this is a meaningless statement? Well, it would be very dangerous for the logical positivist project if that were true, because then that would seem to rule out huge chunks of science. And the verificationists, the positivists absolutely don't want to step on science's toes. They think legitimate science is, the greatest product of human ingenuity in history, and that they should be a service to. So if they start saying that big chunks of science are meaningless, then something's gone wrong. So he says, okay, obviously practical is too strong. We should talk about verifiability in principle. So in principle means even though we can't actually verify whether or not there are mountains on the far side of the moon, we know what it would take to do so. We can specify the conditions that would be necessary to do so. Whereas the absolute enters into, but is itself incapable of evolution and progress, we can't even specify it. So this fails, this passes. That's what we want, because we've weakened it from practical to in principle. Similarly, there's strong versus weak. Strong is the truth of the statement can be conclusively established. That is too strong, because there are certainly things, it seems like Hume, another thing that Hume pointed out is that statements like the generalization of science, like, for example, water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. That's a generalization because it's about all water at any time in any place. It's not talking about this particular sample of water. It's saying this is true of all water. So that's a generalization. Could we prove that to be true? Well, one of the things Hume famously pointed out is that no, we can't. Because in order to prove that true, we would have to prove that all water behaves the same. But we can't do that because we can't test all water. We can't test the water in the future. We can't test water beyond the light cone in our universe. So we cannot prove something that would need to be proved for us to prove any generalization in science. So instead, we need weak verifiability. That is, weak doesn't prove it conclusively, but it is weakly verifiable if it is possible for experience to render it probable. So depending on your account of probability, the more that you test water, and in various circumstances, well, no, it would have to be at sea level, wouldn't it? Because water boils at different temperatures, at different pressures. Well, whatever. In particular, in sea level at particular pressure, the more we test water in those conditions, and it boils at 100 degrees centigrade, the more we appear to have confirmed inductively those generalizations. Now, there's a problem with this. Actually, this is where Popper was most critical of the positivists. He says that you can't actually inductively confirm anything. So Popper famously comes up with an alternative criterion for testing in science, which is falsifiability. And we'll come to that in another video. However, that's the basic idea. And it seems like a good idea. It does seem like an awful lot of philosophy, particularly if you're an analytic philosopher, an awful lot of continental philosophy, of which Heidegger is basically the most lauded practitioner, an awful lot of continental philosophy seems suspiciously bullshit-like. It seems like it's just making words without meaning. So even though logical positivism is considered in the past, like I said, analytic philosophy is committed to the same idea that you should at least, your words should mean something. And that's the core idea here. The core idea is, and there has to be a test for meaningfulness. So yes, actually, let's draw a distinction between the criterion of meaningfulness, which is what Ayer is defending, and what Schlick seems to be suggesting, which is the meaning of a proposition is its method of verification. Notice the difference. Ayer isn't saying that the meaning is the verification. He's saying in order for it to be meaningful, it has to pass this test. So criterion is a test for whether or not it has meaning. Whereas an account of meaning says, here's what the meaning is. This is what meaning consists in. Now, that seems more extreme than this, because it just doesn't seem right to say that the meaning of something is its method of verification. A criticism of this was, suppose you came up with a machine that was an infallible, or discovered this alien computer that was an infallible test of whether or not something could be verified. Then it looks like the meaning of every sentence would be the result of that computer. And that isn't what the meaning of sentences are. Sentences are about things in the world. They're not about the computer itself. So that seems like a bit of a non-starter, but this looks better. But notice how much it rules out. For example, Ayer in Language, Truth and Logic says he's not an atheist. Does he believe in God? No. Then why isn't he an atheist? He isn't an atheist because he says an atheist is someone for whom the statement God exists has truth value. It's false. Obviously, if you're an atheist, you think God exists is false. Whereas he, Ayer, didn't think that it was true or false. He thought that the statement God exists is meaningless. Why? Because it fails the verification principle. There is no evidence that would count for or against it. So in a sense, he's even more extreme than an atheist, because an atheist will at least debate the issue, whereas Ayer would say just all God talk is meaningless. What else? Ethics. Now, that's wrong. What kind of evidence would count in support of the claim that's wrong? Well, another famous quote from Hume is you cannot derive an ought, which is a moral or normative statement, from an is, which is a factual statement. So in other words, there's the world that science describes, there's ethics, and the world doesn't tell us anything about ethics. Well, then it means that nothing will verify ethical statements, like killing is wrong. So does that mean ethics is meaningless? Well, actually, what Ayer says in Language, Truth and Logic is he commits himself to a theory called emotivism. And emotivism is sometimes referred to as the boo-hurrah view of ethics in the British version, or the American version is the yuck or yay theory, which is that actually ethical statements do have meaning, but the meaning isn't what most people think. The meaning of ethical statements is just about the emotional response of the person who said them. So in other words, what killing is wrong means when I say it is killing evokes in me a feeling of disgust or moral outrage. But that's an emotion. It's not outrage about some moral issue, because there's no such thing as morality above and beyond humans' visceral reactions to things. So in other words, when I say killing is wrong, it's as if I'm saying killing, boo, or killing, yuck. Whereas if I approve of something, I'm saying, if I say charity is good, then it's like charity, yay. And so Ayer says, well, look, I'm not saying that they're meaningless, but I'm just saying that they don't mean, there is no logical facts out there in the world. There's just what people feel about things. Now, this theory of ethics has been pretty much decisively trashed almost immediately after it was proposed. There's a guy called Stevenson who probably gave the best formulation of it, but it's pretty much rejected. And that's the trouble with, that's the reason logical positivism is dead, is it commits itself to a lot of other theses that have been trashed. So, for example, think of psychology. If psychology is talking about the mental states of other people, what kind of evidence do we have that those other people have mental states? This is the problem of other minds. We cannot access their mental state. There's no such thing as telepathy. I cannot get inside your head. So if psychology is to be factual, if there are to be factual statements of psychology, they cannot be directly about what's going on in your head, because that's not verifiable to me. So the only kind of things that are verifiable that we think are related to mental states are behaviors. So for example, the statement, so-and-so is in pain, what the verifiable conditions of it are pain behavior. So so-and-so is in pain means they winced and did this. And of course, there are all kinds of problems with this kind of behaviorism. This isn't behaviorism in the sense of B.F. Skinner, but it's kind of a logical behaviorism. It's that the only kind of evidence that would count about other people's mental states is their observable behavior. And of course, there's all kinds of, the most obvious problem with behavior is people can act. Or somebody stoic could be in pain and hide it, and somebody who's a faker could not be in pain and exhibit the behavior. So it just doesn't seem correct. Now, what the positivists would say is, that's the best we got to go on. If you're going to claim that people are in pain because you know that they're in pain because you have access to their minds, that's bullshit. You don't. So if you're going to make claims that are actually legitimately meaningful, they have to be behaviorist claims. There's other problems. For example, what kind of evidence counts about the existence of electrons? Well, we can't directly observe electrons. The ideal of the Vienna Circle is that the way science works is the core claims of science tend to be very theoretical and isolated from observation. But we want to say that they're meaningful and that they tell us something about the world. So there has to be a way to connect those core claims, like generalizations, like Newton's laws or something like that. There has to be a way to connect those to actual observable experience, because otherwise it fails the verifiability criterion. So this is where logic comes in. Logic connects general principles that seem to be very far removed from observational claims, connects them to actual observational claims. So general claims plus logic implies that this would be true, and we observe that being true. And so this is why actually you need a priori truths because we need logic to connect general claims in science to observation sentences. So there's this idea that there are sentences that are directly confirmable by direct experience. That, again, is another contentious issue. What counts as an observation, a direct observation sentence? Is an observation sentence something like I see a cow or something like that? Or does an observation sentence have to be even more basic, like I see patterns, I have certain patterns of sensory stimulation? Because actually what Descartes pointed out is that you don't know you see a cow, you just think you're seeing a cow because you're having a cow experience, but it could be a demon deceiver. So depending on the positivist, its observation sentences are actually just about our experiences, or if they're more bold, then you can say, no, you're legitimately experiencing the external world. So that's the sort of picture, that science is great because it's tied to reality. There are observation sentences that confirm, that have an influence on whether or not the claims of science are true or false, so therefore they're verifiable, they pass the test. Whereas stuff like what Bradley and Heidegger are saying fail the test and can be consigned to the flames. What people like Popper and Quine and other critics point out is it's just not that simple. And this kind of rosy picture of observation sentences being possible doesn't hold up the more you look at it. And Carnap basically spent the rest of his life qualifying and trying to work on this model and come up with a workable model. Let's look at some objections. It only applies to part of language. That is, we've seen when we were talking about Grice's theory of meaning and the ordinary language philosophers, they pointed out that all kinds of sentences were meaningful that you couldn't process in the way that Frege and Russell do. That is, questions, commands, things like that. These are meaningful even though they don't tell you something that is either true or false. How do you verify a question? You don't. So does that mean that it's not meaningful, that questions aren't meaningful? It seems like this criterion misses out a huge chunk of meaningful language. Now, as Miller points out, Ayer himself, when he introduces the criterion of verifiability, he does go on to suggest how it can cover things like questions. He goes on and he says, and with regard to questions, the procedure is the same. We acquire in every case what observations would lead us to the answer to the question one way or the other. And if none can be discovered, we must conclude that the sentence under consideration does not express a genuine question. So what kind of circumstances would cause us to answer the question? Does that work? Well, if it does work, then you can respond to this kind of criticism. We've already looked at this problem. It looks like logical positivism seems to lump together things we want to say are meaningful, like we're in the Matrix, with like literally meaningless sounds. But what the logical positivists can say in response is this just has the surface appearance of meaning, but actually it's like colorless green ideas sleep furiously. We've talked about this. It leads to behaviorism, and people just don't think the meaning of he's in pain is he's wincing. They think it's talking about actual experiences. Here's a key problem. It seems like the principle itself, the verification principle, fails its own test. It has to be either a priori or it has to be testable. Well, it's not a priori. It doesn't seem to be true by definition. Is it testable? What kind of evidence would count in support of the verification principle? That is, that sentences are meaningless unless they're unless they can be verified. It doesn't look like it can. So it looks like it's kind of hypocritical of the verificationists to present this criterion. What counts as direct observation? We've talked about that. Is it like experience that individuals have? And of course, then my observation is completely irrelevant to you, because my observation is sensations that I have that you can't access. Another problem is if math is analytic, as the early Wittgenstein says, and the positivists say, well, that means all of the truths of math are just true by definition. So they're true on the basis of how we've defined the terms. Well, in that case, why is math useful? Why, if we invented it and math is just a product of our definitions, why does math explain so much about the world? And why are mathematicians awarded prizes for discoveries? Well, Ayer's got a response to that. He says, actually, of philosophy, which is also an a priori, an analytic activity, of philosophy and math, he says it's basically just if we were godlike, if we were omniscient, we would understand all the truths of math and philosophy at once, and there would be no discoveries. So discoveries are just a byproduct of us being limited beings. It's like we're finally getting to something that was obvious to the omnipotent being from just the meaning of the words. It's just that we can't keep it all in our head at once, but it's all there at once. It's all consistent. That's his response. Whether or not that's convincing, that's for the philosophers of math to debate. So, long story short, what the logical positivists contribute to, their main focus was science and philosophy of science, but also this principal claim about language is that bits of language are only meaningful insofar as they can be tested or they can be verified. So they connect meaning to verifiability. And this seems like it would be wonderful if it was true, because it would provide us with a way of just trashing the bullshit, you know. And when somebody tells you something that, you know, seems to be meaningless, you say, look, what kind of evidence would confirm or deny what you're saying? It does seem like that there's an important core idea here. But it turns out when you work out all the details, it just doesn't seem to hold water. But as I said, they have had a lasting effect on, they've had good and bad effects on analytic philosophy. Good in the sense that clarity is important and there's less bullshit than there was, at least in analytic philosophy. Bad in that they set back the study of fields like ethics and fields like political science and political philosophy and metaphysics, because they said, that's all bullshit. You don't have to do that. Forget all that stuff. So consequently, you know, doing that kind of philosophy was for a time very much discredited. It was like you were doing alchemy or something, because you were doing something that had been shown to be pointless. It was only sort of by the 70s that these fields started to explode again, once the influence of the positivists had finally waned. Logical positivism.